Vampires. Nature's way of giving leeches some humanity. Vampires as of today are depicted as cunning, powerful, immortal, blood-dependent, and very often quite successful beings, with a weakness to the sun, to silver, and with at least an aversion to onions. And of course, they procreate by passing on the vampire curse, aka their immortality, the eternal youth, their supernatural strength, agility, the ability to cast or employ some form of magic, and so on and so forth. You know, it's definitely just a curse, by biting and then somehow transforming the victim into yet another cursed being. So, given all of this, how would actual realistic vampires live in a society? And most importantly, rise to become a lord, a count, or at least a baron, in the medieval times, as well in a fantasy setting. And I personally suggest that vampires would either grow really old and powerful, or, and this is probably the case for the majority of vampires, would die pretty early, because they think of themselves as something superior to humanity, which in many aspects they pretty much are, but who then just make the mistake of angering not just a couple of guys, but entire towns, villages, and smaller nations, who then dedicate a huge amount of resources to hunt them down. One human might not be a danger to a vampire, but a dozen might be, and a mob of hundreds of angry villagers armed with pitchforks, torches, and the odd silver cutlery here and there would just tear the vampire to shreds, after the young hotshot managed to kill a couple of them. They would bury the dead, and then become hostile to outsiders, and for example have old people watch everything that goes on in their neighborhood, in their village. So business as usual as far as villagers in medieval and even today's times are concerned. And if you add magic to the human, let's just say it would take significantly less of a number to take on a vampire, which brings us to fantasy's most used remedy, Fireball. So while the young and overambitious vampires would die pretty early, those who are more restrained, calculating, cunning, or those who have just learned a lesson from a mistake or from watching somebody else pulling a Leroy Jenkins and running straight into a castle only to be covered in pitch and set ablaze the next day on the market square. So the vampires dedicate to hide his true nature, and he will become perhaps a soldier or a traveler, someone who wouldn't be looked strange upon if he stays the exactly same for 50 or 60 years. Now, he will still probably have to change identities every now and then, but with time and knowledge, the vampire will learn that his greatest assets aren't his claws, fangs or spells, but his mind that wields all of it. Being immortal means that he can learn indefinitely, and while we mortals think of ourselves as quite unique, the fact that anyone could with some frightening degree of accuracy determine whether or not we are old or young, man or woman, whether or not we vote for this political party or the other, are we vegans or meat eaters, are we able to digest milk or not, are we parents or children, do we live together or alone, are we living in a small village, a town or a big metropolis, how wealthy we are, what social circles we frequent, not by spying on us for months on end, but just by looking at our likes on social media sites. Again, there's a margin of error, of course, but it's pretty frightening how easily we are predicted. And vampires could learn to predict our behavior and decipher our attentions and emotions just by micro gestures, the way we speak, how we dress, what we are carrying with us, and so on and so forth. And this means that surviving vampires, those who have a couple of centuries of experience, would become excellent manipulators, in addition to being great fighters, casters, and, since they can turn into bats and wolves, great infiltrators. And if the vampire knows what someone needs, what he's willing to pay, and whether or not he is willing to honor a bargain or not, he can leverage his magic, his strength and knowledge to acquire more and more might over decades and the centuries. Let's say you're a powerful noble, but your eldest son is a bit of a Joffrey. So just have him poisoned at his own wedding and blame his wife, thus discrediting a rival family in the process, and therefore making their fortune yours. And if you have to pay this specialist in poisoning with a bit of land and perhaps even a marriage with some of your very, very distant relatives, then this is all well and good. Now, the vampire in question, who, assuming he wants to become powerful indeed, and not just making some human-vampire hybrids for the next couple of decades, which, since vampires are a thing could actually happen, doesn't need to commit to any rash actions once a single of his many plays have actually paid off. He doesn't need to assassinate the other members of his noble family. He merely needs to avoid suspicion, while forging alliances, building a power base, and inherit whatever the other members have. Because, bit by bit, time will do the work of a vampire for him. And if someone just refuses to die, let's just say if you and the other person would be lost at sea, well, nobody would suspect you, because you too are dead, even though your body is never found, and your eldest son, who very, very much looks like his father, would then step up and take his father's place, and whatever fortune the noble in question had. So no one suspects a thing, and if somebody indeed does, let's just say if the nobility can die, then perhaps a curious servant girl, or the odd caught-in-the-act burglar will provide a fine extra meal, while the wolves and ravens living on the vampire lord's land will have fun with the rest of the body. And that's how a powerful vampire with immense influence could acquire his position, as a one-man dynasty essentially. And next time, we will take a look how the vampire could use his power, how allied and rival vampires might interact with him, and how doing the same thing as I have just described could be considerably harder in today's society. While of course, being seen as a dangerous monster and hunted down by society in a medieval or a medieval fantasy setting would be a bit of a disadvantage, to be honest, the very fact that you actually are monstrously powerful would still greatly benefit you. While you perhaps can't outfight a village, you can still outrun it by turning into a bat or a wolf. You would also accumulate more and more knowledge and gather more and more experience with humans and how they behave. Therefore, eventually, you would be able to manipulate them quite well. And as a powerful fighter or magic caster, you would be able to get quite a bit of wealth out of your talents and abilities. But your greatest asset would be, paradoxically, the lack of informations others have. See? In pre-information age times, information would travel very slowly. The very idea of keeping up with the news is just a century old at this point, and even then, the odd article about a blood-sucking monster could be seen as a rumor, a fairy tale, or just a description of a rather kinky ex-wife spread by a disgruntled husband mending his bite wounds. So even though the existence of vampires are known, the vampires would have an easy time to avoid most of the problems, because people in Village A don't know that the guy causing the bite wounds is living on the other side of a mountain chain in Village B, 200 miles down south, or in Castle C, and is way too connected to political power and influence than to even become the target of any potential investigation. Also the odd social behavior like never leaving your house when it's sunny outside or only drinking this strange, fake, red wine won't become obvious to anybody, because it happens in a castle. And even if there's a vampire scare and people are being accused of being vampires left and right and center, vampires, at least those who have experience and are cunning, will most likely not become the target, because A, they can hide in the forest as a bat or a wolf, or as a nobleman in his cottage on the countryside, and B, they can even use this vampire scare in order to accuse anyone opposed or dangerous to them of being a vampire themselves. I mean, a rich man bribing his way into an office only to use it then for his own personal gains isn't rather than unusual, so vampire hunters should be not immune to all of this influence taking. And of course, accusing our noble vampire hunter of being a vampire themselves is something only a true vampire would do, and therefore whoever said this needs to be impaled. And C, if all of this fails, a vampire can just fight to flee. As long as he isn't cornered in a dark cave or so, he can jump out of a window and turn himself into a bat, or he can become a wolf and maul that plucky band of kid detectives that exposed his evil schemes in Wacky Monsters of the Week episodes before fleeing the town. But all of this would be nigh on impossible in our modern day and age, because first and foremost, in a time where arms relied on one's own body strength, a supernaturally strong magic vampire would be very dangerous indeed. He could wield weapons with a bigger reach, or turn a rock into essentially a bullet if he throws it hard enough. And even in a setting with magic, vampires are almost always described as powerful mages, so they would be able to at least counter a fireball spell or two before being roasted alive. But in our world, so the United States, if we go by alien movie logic, the flamethrowers are not even seen as a weapon, but as mere tools in the majority of US states. And remember, the United States is a place where more guns than people exist. And if the civilian population is better armed than the military of 100 smaller nations, feeding on the population even on the countryside in a remote village, while the odd attempt here and there might be successful, would ultimately end with the vampire's own end or immobilization. Now I know what you're thinking. Lead does not immobilize vampires, and you are technically correct. The best kind of correct. A single bullet won't do much, but let's just say a couple hundred rounds might stop a vampire pretty effectively, even if it is just because of the weight in his body. And as for turning into a bat and flying away, let's just say that the highest number of planes is owned by the US Air Force, and that the second biggest number of planes is owned by the US Navy. But my point is, even without the US military, you would probably see headlines like "Florida man accidentally neutralizes vampire" while trying to stop pet crocodile being eaten by pet snake. So in this environment, where brute force would lead to a quick end, the vampire would either have to go to the rest of the world and, let's say, prey on people in remote villages or something like that, because the vampire in question refuses to abandon the old ways where he ruled over his flock of scared villagers, or, and this is probably the smarter move, come out as a vampire and, for example, become a vampire influencer, unironically living in Romania, describing the life of a vampire, that of course the evil vampires were all killed long ago by this brave, heroic vampire hunter known as Vlad the Impaler, and so on and so forth. You know, reassure the population that you are no threat to them, but something awesome, a curiosity. I mean, this would be surprisingly viable. I mean, after all, Romania has a very high average internet speed. And let's say a vampire reacting to the Twilight movies would be hilarious. So just preemptively putting yourself out in the open and using your wealth in order to buy public favor, or at least the favor of public officials, would be achievable by just using money and your skills of manipulation. And remember, it's not corruption if you line the pockets of politicians in exchange for favors. It's called lobbying, and it's art. And the reason why vampires should, in my opinion, stop hiding is because there is no way other than at the very end of the world where vampires could live undiscovered, because social media is everywhere, cameras are everywhere, and even the slightest unusual thing will now be picked up immediately. A vampire trying to hide will probably be discovered by such minor things as never touching silver cutlery, rather than because he stays inside all day and only comes out at night, which will be probably seen as very relatable and as typical Gen Z behavior, because remember, the vampire does not age. This of course assumes that the vampire actually shows up on cameras. Also, as someone who stays eternally young and can give away the quote-unquote vampire curse, I would suggest that many state leaders, rich people and beauty bloggers would do anything to get this quote-unquote curse. And at this point where the vampire lives openly and just buys the blood packages he needs to sustain himself, there should be a serious drawback to this passing on the vampire curse. Or everybody would eventually try to become a vampire, and then they all would starve to death because there are no longer any humans around to sustain them. Maybe a vampire can only create another vampire every 100, 500 or 1000 years. Or maybe only one vampire can create 2 other vampires before he himself will fade into the darkness or something like that. You know, one for each fang. Or the vampires will getting weaker and weaker the more vampires are produced, which would then incentivize the vampires to stop creating more vampires. Or let's say that vampires can only have one true heir, and the rest, the non-true heirs, will just be zombified or turn into actual bats or something like that. You know, there needs to be a limiter on this curse. And if it isn't, let's just say a zombie apocalypse would be way more interesting if it was in truth a vampire apocalypse where all of these starving, bloodthirsty vampires try to hunt down the last remaining humans. I thought it is time to share my opinions on how realistic vampires would fight each other in our modern world. Because while battles between vampires in, let's say, the medieval times would also be quite interesting, they would essentially just be powerful nobles that command armies. They would devastate the lands and holdings of other vampires, while also trying to protect their own. So 2 vampires fighting in this world wouldn't be much different from just regular medieval warfare. While in today's societies, vampires face a bunch of dangers that far surpasses their supernatural abilities and their occult might. First and foremost, for any vampire, doxing, aka their true identity, their name and address being leaked on the internet, as well as the fact that they are indeed a supernatural vampire, would be akin to a death sentence. If a mob with torches and pitchforks is already a problem, militias, armed with flamethrowers and modern guns, would probably topple entire vampire dynasties. So if the modern public knows, or if only a small percentage of the population believes in vampires, the vampire in question is effectively unable to traverse the nation he lives in for centuries. But since revealing a secret vampire society in a nation would put all vampires in danger, I think that this would be treated like a nuclear first strike and carry a similar taboo with it. Now, aside from the nuclear option, the vampires would probably, if there indeed is a wider society of vampires connected to one another, impose certain rules of engagement in order to prevent their secret society from being exposed. And if you have very similar sides of a conflict, and both sides are living in a wider society that expects a certain behavior and sanctions transgressions quite heavily, vampire conflicts would probably be rather civilized. Maybe an honor duel would be the way to resolve things, and whoever draws first blood wins, or even be declared the winner by the other vampires around them. And yes, these duels could also be deadly and quite vicious, but always be fought in constraints and in a secret organization in the shadows, never public. So imagine vampire fights under this premise be like the fights in the movie The Duelist or the Honor Duel in Effie Briest. There would be a set of rules on how to engage one's enemy, and also a social expectation to defend one's honor as a vampire in the face of slights and personal attacks. This would limit the effects of any vampire conflict and prevent a society from being exposed to an ever increasingly well-armed human population that would now by far outnumber them. As for the kind of duel, I think anything from unarmed combat to various melee arms to pistols firing holy or garlic-drenched bullets aimed at the heart of one another, everything would essentially go, as long as nobody else could witness it. So launching rockets at one another or something like this would be probably out of the question. And just like at court, we would also see some intrigues, while both parties keep up a cordial facade. And of course no vampire story would be complete without some intrigues, while both parties keep up a cordial facade at social gatherings. Both parties try to undermine the other, perhaps try to overtake a very profitable company by very subtle means, marriage politics, and a complex ever-shifting set of alliances without upsetting the other side so much that more drastic measures would be taken. So vampires in conflict in the modern world would be very much an interesting story, focused on the characters and their interactions, their ideas, their beliefs, convictions, and their wits, instead of a big fancy explosion and epic battle set. Anyway, this is at least my opinion on how vampires in modern settings and societies could behave. And of course, there are probably countless other ideas and settings for a modern vampire story. And if you have any of those in mind, please let me know down in the comment section. And with that said, I say thank you very much for watching and have a nice day.